evening's meeting of the Audit Committee. The usual housekeeping before we start then, please remember that the meeting is being recorded and all the rest of it. Before we go through the agenda, I am going to make one change to the order of items this evening. Item 6, which is the Audit Wales review of outsourced leisure services. I'm going to put that to the bottom of the agenda following discussions with the leisure services team. If we make a start then, first of all, with apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies?
No apologies, Chair, everyone's present.
Okay, fantastic. If we move on to item 2 then, which is the minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of December. Do we have any questions or comments relating to the minutes?
Yes, I do.
Okay, Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, on page 360, all right, what does WRAP stand for? W-R-A-P. Yeah, with regard to operational work around WRAP.
I think that's the
Waste
assessment plan.
Chair.
Okay, is it good practice though, isn't it, if we use an acronyms like that, whenever it's a public minutes, that you can use the acronym second time, but first time we should have the proper title and then in brackets round the word.
Yeah, I can change that if the committee is happy. I can we can add it to this set of minutes after they're approved. Thank you.
Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Yes, just to make the point, I appreciate Councillor Wilson, what Councillor Wilson is saying, but WRAP is an acronym for Waste Resources Action Programme, and it's an organisation which is usually referred to as WRAP. And actually to refer to them by the full title would probably be as much confusing as simply referring to them as the acronym. So I appreciate his point, but WRAP is an organisation, and that is how they are usually referred to.
Thank you.
Do we want to have a vote over this, Councillor Johnson?
Personally, I think the way of sorting that, if the committee would be content, would be for WRAP to be clarified as the Waste Resources Action Programme. Therefore, anybody who is not familiar with that organisation, at least it provides some context as to what it does. So, are we all content with that?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. If we move on to item 3 then, which is to receive declarations of interest.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, before that, could we have somebody do propose and second the minutes as amended?
Happy to propose and with the amendments.
Second.
Thank you for that. On to item 3 then, which is to receive declarations of interest.
Yes.
Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, I like to declare declarations of interest on item, well, it depends which item number it is now, on the corporate risk register, which is item 8. Okay, I have got dispensation to speak, but not to vote on matters relating to Cardiff and Bell College.
Okay.
And also on item number 5 on reshaping services, I got dispensation to speak and vote as I am a Penarth Town Councillor.
Do we have any other declarations of interest? Councillor Drake.
I probably would like to say that I'm a Barrytown councillor as well. So I got, I think that affects quite a few of us, doesn't it?
Councillor Norman.
The same for me.
Councillor MacArthur.
Yeah, I'm a Twin Hattie councillor, I have dispensation to speak and vote.
Councillor Rowlands.
Same as well for Barrytown Council.
Councillor Johnson.
Also have dispensation to speak and vote on issues relating to reshaping services as a double-hatted member of Barry Town Council and Berkeley Northern Council.
Okay, I think that's everybody. If we move on to item 4 then, which is a presentation on the Local Government and Elections Act.
Good evening, Chair. With your permission, I'll share a screen with some slides to accompany this item, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely fine.
And that should be showing for you now.
Yeah.
Okay, we thought it would be useful to bring you a summary of the Act, and Mark and myself will talk you through this. This is the Local Government and Elections Act as it is now, and you'll be aware that we took a report to the Council's Cabinet in December and referred that on to Corporate Performance and Resources last month. This presentation has been slightly updated and tailored for your committee, Chair. So to give you a summary, this is a really wide-ranging piece of legislation. It covers multiple aspects such as electoral reform, public participation, governance and performance, as well as regional working. It was introduced in 2019 and it passed through the Senedd on the 18th of November last year and had royal assent in January. It replaces the current arrangements for improvement in terms of the duties that the local government measure had in place, and it sets out a new approach to the way that we manage performance, governance and improvement, and it puts more of an emphasis on proactivity within local authorities in terms of how we look at our internal processes and procedures in the context of delivering better outcomes, and we'll describe that in a little bit of detail in the next few slides. So just to give you a flavour of some of the aspects of the legislation, in terms of reforming electoral arrangements for local government, it extends the voting franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, for example, so they'll be able to vote in the forthcoming Senedd elections. It enables local authorities to choose for their local authority elections between first past the post or single transferable vote systems. It codifies the change that we've seen in recent years around electoral cycles for local authorities to 5-year terms, and it does make some changes to enabling non-politically restricted council staff to be enabled to stand for election in their own authority areas, but they must resign if they're successfully elected. And it also removes returning officer fees for local elections. The Act will introduce later on in this calendar year the general power of competence, so councils are able to undertake any activity that they're not disabled from doing through other statute, as long as it's in taking forward the well-being objectives of the authority. And it also introduces some reforms to public participation. So there's a very strong emphasis on encouraging local people to participate in local government, and it makes certain provisions around aspects such as broadcasting meetings, flexibility for members in terms of remote attendance at meetings, and also introducing some changes to the way that petitions and community polls work. There are some important reforms around democratic governance and leadership. So currently, local authorities are headed up by a head of paid service. We have that role within the managing director post. This legislation will require the appointment of a chief executive, and specific duties are prescribed for that post. It also makes some important changes to the way cabinets work, enabling job sharing for leaders and cabinet members, and it also enables the appointment of assistants to cabinet members. Makes some changes as well in terms of family absence provisions, and also stipulates a requirement for the leaders of political groups to promote and maintain high standards of conduct by all members of their groups. The reports that Cabinet saw in December and Corporate Performance Committee considered in January, on that agenda, there was one report around the collaborative working aspect. So the establishment of corporate joint committees, which is a significant part of this legislation. We haven't gone into much detail within the presentation for you this evening, Chair, but if members would like more information on that, we can certainly provide links to the Cabinet and subsequent committee reports on that. But basically what it does is put into statute powers for ministers to establish those those corporate joint committees, and it prescribes the functions for which those will be put in place. It also introduces some change to performance and governance, which I'll talk about in a moment, and that has direct implications for your committee. And finally, the legislation introduces powers to facilitate voluntary mergers of principal councils, should people wish to do so. So I don't know if anyone's got any questions at that stage. My apologies, I can't now see if anyone has got their hands up.
I don't see any hands raised, Tom, so
I do.
Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, I was going back to your first slide. You asked about participation by the electorate. If you go back to the first slide, I think, yeah, and it basically is asking for some sort of strategy or report. Do you know when we will do that as a council?
Absolutely, Councillor Wilson. I'll come on to the phasing of these different aspects of the bill, if I may. But I think that one is a 2022 requirement. There are the bill is to be the act is to be brought into force across the next probably 16 to 18 months, I think. But I can come on to that in a little while if that's okay with you.
Fine.
I see no other hands up, Tom, so feel free to carry on with the presentation.
Thank you, Chair. So just a little bit more information now in terms of the performance and governance aspects, if I may. As I said earlier, this Act replaces the local government measure, which is the legislation that previously has governed the way that I've brought to you the performance reporting regime. And the idea is that this puts the onus more upon local authorities to continually improve, and importantly draws the links between performance, governance and overall improvement. We've done a lot of work in recent years in terms of bringing together our duties under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, so talking about and demonstrating how we've exhibited the 5 ways of working in the pursuance of our wellbeing objectives. But this legislation requires us to go even further, and what it does is link aspects of showing how we're exercising functions effectively with value for money, so how we use our resources economically, efficiently and effectively, and then also brings together governance aspects. The legislation has got 7 specific duties. The first 5 are for local authorities, and then the latter are for Welsh Government and the Auditor General. So the ones that are specifically for us are a duty to keep performance under review, and committee will be aware that we currently do this through an annual planning cycle. But as I say, this now needs us to be augmenting it in terms of showing those links between effectiveness, efficiency and economy, as well as good governance and our functions. As we talked about earlier, there's an aspect around public participation, and this Act introduces a duty to consult on performance. It talks about having to consult at least once in the financial year about how we're going about meeting our performance requirements, and it stipulates the statutory consultees. And I can provide assurance to Audit Committee that these people are, or these groups of stakeholders rather, are people we would ordinarily consult with performance on, but it puts it into the legislation. It sets out a specific duty in terms of reporting on performance. It doesn't say the date that you have to publish the report, but it should be as soon as possible following the conclusion of the financial year. So I would anticipate that we will do this as we currently do in the summer, or very early after the summer recess. But what as an Act it does do in terms of departing from some of the existing mechanisms is introduce this duty to arrange a panel assessment of performance. And the panel assessment is an external panel that the council must commission. The assessment panel must be convened once in each electoral cycle. There is a cost for holding these statutory peer assessments, and that's a cost that needs to be subsumed by the council. And the legislation sets out the minimum composition in terms of the skills mix and background of the panel assessors. We're working with the WRGA in terms of developing some standardised terms of reference for the panel, so that we don't have 22 local authorities doing the same thing over and over again. But that panel assessment is, as I say, that external view once in the electoral cycle at a time that is to be determined by the local authority. We then have a duty to respond to that panel assessment report, and the legislation stipulates that the Audit and Governance Committee is an integral part of that. So we produce a response to the panel assessment report, and that panel assessment plus our response is then taken through the democratic process, which includes bringing it to the Audit and Governance Committee. And then finally, in terms of the provisions, not for ourselves, but for the Auditor General, special inspection powers, should it be determined, and also powers for the Welsh Government to provide both support and assistance in cases where performance is deemed to warrant improvement, but also importantly, powers for the Welsh ministers to intervene if it is seen or may not be meeting performance requirements. And then finally, the legislation just notes the context that the socio-economic duty, which members will be aware of as being an aspect of the Equalities Act that hasn't been enacted so far, will now come into force on the 31st of March. And that's important because that introduces a statutory duty on the authority to consider issues of socio-economic disadvantage when taking strategic decisions. And I'll be taking a report through Cabinet and Scrutiny Committee in the next few weeks, talking about how we're looking to implement that, so that that will dovetail as part of those things. That's a really quick overview of the performance and governance aspects. And before I hand over to Mark, Chair, I don't know if anyone has any questions on those particular provisions.
I can see Councillor Wilson has had his hand up for some time, so if we go back to Councillor Wilson first and then any other member who wishes to raise anything. Mark, if you're speaking, I think you're mute.
I just will repeat what I just said. I'm saying in terms of the panel, what's the makeup of the panel? Will they be people who are perhaps ex-councillors, for example, being hypothetical, or they're going to be ex-officers, or are they going to be barred? That's one area. Or do they have to have? Do they have to be resident of the Vale Glamorgan? Because I don't know the answer to that, or not. Would they represent businesses in the Vale Glamorgan? Because I don't know about that. So I think a makeup of the panel would be useful. Also, would they be paid, or if not, if they pay, will it be compensated for any time lost? Because obviously, if they're business people or people in employment, then you would expect them to be kind of compensated. That's this in terms of second socio-economic duty. I hope that report will also go to scrutiny, corporate resources in particular. So those are my two questions.
Tom?
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Yes, I can. While Mark is doing his part of the presentation, I'm just going to double check the specifics in terms of panel composition. But no, they don't have to be residents of the Vale Glamorgan. It does stipulate around both political and officers being involved, so I can certainly check that. So I'm going to get some further detail to answer your question after Mark has presented, if that's okay, Councillor Wilson. And in terms of the socio-economic duty, the current thinking in terms of the reference from Cabinet onto Scrutiny Committee was to the Learning and Culture Committee because of the terms of reference of that committee, including the equalities aspect. So that would be what I would traditionally have done, but obviously it's the view of the Audit Committee if you wanted to make your thoughts known on the path of that.
Make my thoughts known to Cabinet about that. I'd appreciate it in the minutes. Thank you.
Okay, on the assumption that there are no further questions and that is the end of your part of the presentation, Tom, I'll hand over to Mark.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tom. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, as Tom has alluded to, really, one of the parts that's affected by the changes in the legislation is obviously the Audit Committee. Plus, if you go on to the next slide, if you could, Tom, if you can hear me. There we are. Yeah, the detail there is just one slide that put all the relevant details onto the one slide. And if you recall, members, we had a bit of a discussion on some of the aspects of this at the last meeting. But basically, Section 115 of the Act comes into force in April 21, so next April, and basically surrounds the title, which Tom has already mentioned, the performance assessment aspect, and also linked to complaints. If I just take you through the bullet points there, the title of the committee will change to Governance and Audit Committee. So that's that won't be a surprise to you. That's one of the things that's been mentioned previously. Tom's already mentioned that there are a couple of performance aspects that the Governance and Audit Committee will need to consider, and that includes the committee will need to consider the Council's draft annual performance self-assessment report, and if deemed necessary, make recommendations for changes to the Council, and also then to receive the Council's finalised annual self-assessment report in respect of a financial year as soon as reasonably practical after the end of that financial year. Now, even though the duties are coming into effect from April 2021, because of the performance regime taking place, the likely timeline for actually the committee receiving these reports is likely to be in 2022. So, but that's the duties are being put in place from April 2021. The next bullet point there talks about the panel, the committee considering the independent panel performance assessment report once in a council term. So that's already been touched on as well, but that's the other part that's specifically mentioned, and also to receive and review the council's draft response to the report from that panel. And again, that'll be some time away, and it'll be for the council to determine when that happens. And the next two remaining points relate to the council's ability to deal with complaints effectively. So that's a new duty. I know the committee receives reports in any event in relation to corporate complaints, but that's making it a particular duty. And then the final bullet point under that section is to make reports and recommendations in relation to the council's ability to deal with complaints effectively. In relation to implementing these particular requirements, guidance is still being developed at the moment by Welsh Government, and no doubt the implementation will need to be worked through as those details emerge over the coming months. The next part, really, which I think sparked a bit more of a debate and discussion at the last meeting, relates to section 116, 117 and 118 of the Act, which come into effect in May 2022, so a year May, and that relates to lay membership on the committee and also the chairing of the committee. So you'll see there on the bullet points, 1/3 of the committee's membership must be made up from laypersons appointed by the council. So that'll be coming in from May 2022. The Governance and Audit Committee will also be required to be chaired by a lay member to be elected by the committee. So that's obviously a change as well. And the third point there, the vice chair elected by the committee may be a Vale of Glamorgan councillor or a lay member, but must not be a member of the authority's cabinet brackets executive or an assistant to its executive. So those are the all of the points really that are relevant to the Governance and Audit Committee. Obviously, you'll note the different timescales, and some of the detail will need to be worked through. For example, recruitment of lay members. There has been discussions around doing that on a national basis to avoid the need to, 22 councils, as Tom mentioned earlier, repeating the same exercise 22 times and so on, and looking for people with similar skills and so on. But again, that's yet to be worked through. Okay, thank you, Chair. Happy to take any questions.
Councillor Wilson.
I've got a couple of questions, mostly about the makeup of these independent members. One theory I may have is that we got 22 authorities. One of my concerns is that we may not have, well, one is obviously the calibre of these people. Will they have to be qualified in any way or shape or form? Because after all, to understand financial reports and everything else, I would expect they have to be pretty qualified. That's the first move, especially if they're going to be chairing it and steering the council on this. So that's the first thing I think they need to be looked into. It'd be interesting to see what the regs say about that. Secondly, would it be possible in theory to be on more than one council as a lay member? Because obviously if that is the case, that could cause issues, especially since we know, as we are working with neighbouring authorities very closely in Audit in particular. And thirdly, of course, has the council, or have yourselves considered, I know some organisations, not necessarily councils, but some have what we establish a search committee as well to look into people. So we develop a committee which spends all its time just finding people to represent. I know when I used to be a governor at Cardiff and Vale College, we certainly had a search committee. We'd be looking for people from outside in the public arena to be governors of the college. And I wondered, are we looking to establish one of those, and can we do that in any case?
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Wilson. In terms of being qualified, there's been no detail published in relation to any of the 3 points that you've raised, actually. I think the expectation will be that lay members will have particular skills and qualifications that they can bring to bear, but there's nothing been published as yet that I've seen. The current guidance will probably still apply in terms of what SIPFA suggest as sort of useful skills for lay members of audit committees, but nothing's been published as yet in terms of specific skills or requirements around qualifications and so on. In relation to the ability to be able to sit on an audit committee for more than one council, again, there's nothing I've seen that indicates that in a positive or a negative way. My suspicion is that we will find some lay members who will possibly sit on more than one if there is a limited sort of field out there in terms of suitable candidates, but that remains to be seen. And your point around having a sort of a search committee, that's not something that I've heard mentioned or discussed, and I think that may be something to look at, but possibly to be looked at in parallel with any plans nationally around recruitment of lay members. Okay, thank you.
Can I come back to you, Mark, on those points?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously,
yeah,
it's very concerning that since I know that this new committee will establish in April 21, which is only next month. And I know, admittedly, the things I'm talking about are mostly will come to May 22. We haven't got a great deal of time to put this into place, especially if these things are missing. I've just wondered, thinking of the external auditors being here as well, would they have a view about this? Because clearly we're looking at the efficiency and the effectiveness of the audit committee, and I'm not opposed to what they're doing. I understand the reasoning for it, but I'd be interested to see what the external auditors' view on this as well is.
I can see that Mr. Lewis had his hand up. I have seen you, Paul.
Okay.
If I just allow Tom and Steve to answer that point first, and then I'll come to you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Shall I come in now? First,
Yes.
Do you mind, Tom? Yes. I probably haven't got the answers, but I can certainly offer a perspective on this. And my perspective is really, because I don't know the motives, to be honest, in terms of why there's going to be the intention to have more lay members. But from what I've experienced and seen at some of the other audit committees which I attend, which admittedly are in the central government sector, not in the local government sector, I see people from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of professional backgrounds on those audit committees. So there may be lawyers there, qualified solicitors. There might be people who've worked in the senior levels in the private sector and from the business world. There'd be qualified accountants. There'd be IT specialists. So there's people that can contribute all sorts of skills, if you like, to this audit committee and other, obviously, local government audit committees. So I can imagine that might be the intention. That's one perspective. That's one perspective. Obviously, talking about the timescales, I can admit, I can see your point there, Councillor Wilson. You know, that is going to be a challenge, but you're all working in the same environment, so you know, and all councils are operating in that environment. So I don't know. That's something for the council to address, I guess, and we'll be obviously keeping you know, a watch, I guess, in terms of how this progresses.
Okay, thank you for that, Steve. Tom, did you want to come in? Tom, I think you're on mute. Okay, I'm not sure if there are technical difficulties there. If I move on to Paul then, and we'll come back to Tom as and when he's able to connect to us.
Okay, can you hear me, Mr. Chairman? Yes,
loud and clear.
You can hear me. Okay, thank you. Well, I made my views quite clear on this proposal at the last meeting, and I see that it was minuted, which I'm pleased about. I still retain the same, how can I say, worries about whether or not you will find suitably qualified people who want to do this job, and whether or not, which is more important, because I was qualified. I mean, I used to be an accountant, so you know, in my case, I could probably say, well, I could do the job easily enough. It's not difficult. It's something I'm used to. I was a managing director. I can chair meetings, etc. But it's the understanding of the council's mechanisms and workings, and the steering committees, and the all this sort of thing. What goes on in the council is not obvious to anyone who's never been a councillor. And it's very difficult to understand how the workings of the council, you know, the machinations, how they all work. And despite the fact that now I'm in my 10th year as a lay member, I still would not want to be landed with the responsibility of chairing a very important committee like this. And I think that I know it's gone through now and there's nothing we can do about it. We're going to have to live with it. But I think it's irresponsible. I really do. Honestly. That's all I want to say.
Thank you for that, Mr. Lewis. I can see Councillor Johnson did have his... Yes, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Chair. I'll be brief. I mean, it's been discussed in this committee. It's been discussed in corporate performance and resources. I think that Mr. Lewis's points were also mentioned in the corporate performance and resources meeting. But this is the law. This has gone through. This is what Councillor Wilson's sounded slightly aggressive, but this is his party's position on how these things should be done, and it's up to our officers to ensure that we have a handover, crossover, that accurately reflects what the legislation is. Not everything is written down yet. The guidance is still being drafted, as Tom was saying and Mark was saying earlier. And we just work our way through this process, which concludes obviously after the next set of local elections. I don't know if Councillor Wilson is looking to rejoin the committee after he's lost his seat. That's up to him. But but this is the situation. There's not much point in us flapping our gums about it. We just work our way through it and develop a recruitment process that I think Councillor Wilson's search committee idea was very good, and we should be recommending that probably as a committee, that the council sort of does something or undertakes sort of work to recruit individuals across a range of roles within the council that can provide support for us. So I think that's a very good idea from Councillor Wilson, and if he wants to recommend that, then I'm happy to second it, or vice versa, because I think that's a good way forward for us. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Wilson, did you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I do. It was a bit rough and smooth there from Councillor Johnson there. You started off a bit rough, then you got a bit smooth, all right? As you know, first and foremost, I'm here as an audit committee member. I just happen to be a Labour committee member, as rightly said, and I'm a Labour member. And this admittedly is Welsh Government, and I understand it's dominated by Labour. But clearly we've had partners and we've had agreements with our political parties, and which I know you've been part of as well. So, you know, but I don't want to go into politics on this. I think I'd like to recommend, I'm prompting from Councillor Johnson here, but I'd like to recommend that perhaps we do consider looking into the feasibility of setting up a search committee that could look into the appointment of independent members, as you rightly said, not just necessarily on audit, perhaps on other committees as well, like standards, for example, where I know it does take place. But I do think, you know, thank you for that suggestion. I was going to make that suggestion anyway, but thank you for reading my mind about that. And that's what I like to put forward. Thank you.
Okay, I think at this point then, are there any other questions or comments, first of all? I've made my views on this clear in this committee and in corporate performance and resources, I think, as well. So rather than waste time with a large agenda, I'm sure anyone who wishes to see them can refer back to those committees. If we put Councillor Wilson's recommendation to a vote, then I'm happy to support that. Do we have unanimous agreement on that? Okay, if we could send that recommendation back to Cabinet then, please, or to Cabinet, I should say. And other than that, thank you so much, Tom and Steve, for that report. It was really insightful, and thank you for your time pulling it together and informing us once again. If we move on then to item 5, which is the Audit Wales Reshaping Services Programme Review.
My apologies, Chair, for dropping out. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. My apologies. And Councillor Wilson's point around the composition of panels, if it's okay with you, Chair, I've got the relevant part of the guidance. I'll email it to Gareth to distribute to Audit Committee members after the meeting, if that's okay. You've got a reference this evening from Corporate Performance and Resources Committee on, as you say, the Reshaping Services review that colleagues at Audit Wales conducted. It's important to note that the report was, or the field work for this report was done between December of 2019 and February of last year. It was finalised then in the summer of last year, and we've then taken the response through corporate performance, and as part of our regulatory report tracking process, we bring them to Audit Committee for yourselves to consider. The review was undertaken as part of our overall assurance work for the year, and it found that overall the programme was effectively managed and has helped to deliver savings, but Audit Wales suggested that now there was an opportunity to refocus the programme and to strengthen workforce planning to support its delivery. So the report from Audit Wales colleagues is appended to the reference, and it makes importantly 5 proposals for improvement. Those proposals are around the work with partner organisations, which is one part of the programme's existing objectives. Secondly, we were talking with Audit Wales about an intention to move away from primarily associating reshaping with savings, but also to look at other aspects of transformational change. And a proposal for improvement is included that we should therefore review the criteria used to determine how we include projects within the programme portfolio, and also the measures that we use to monitor the progress of those projects. It makes a couple of proposals around the workforce and support for council staff, so looking at identifying further training and support around necessary skills, and importantly to make sure that that's reflected in the forthcoming workforce plan, which will obviously support the delivery of reshaping services, and that we need to document those aspects within project documentation. And then finally, a proposal for improvement is included here in terms of identifying lessons that we've learned from earlier projects so that we can strengthen any identified areas of weakness and obviously build on any particular successes. Appendix B to the reference is the Council's action plan, and with the comments from yourselves at Audit Committee Chair, the whole reference will then go through to Cabinet for approval, and the actions that we're taking would then be reflected in the 6 monthly updates that this committee receive on all of our regulatory recommendations and proposals for improvement. And I wanted to draw committee's attention to the fact that we will be taking a report to Cabinet in a week's time, setting out the basis for a future direction of the Reshaping Services programme, and just to provide assurance to the Audit Committee that this report from Audit Wales is appended to that, and that we've taken the opportunity to reflect on those proposals for improvement. They are reflected in the forthcoming proposals that we're looking to take through Cabinet and would be referred on to Corporate Performance and Resources Committee. So that's just a very brief overview of the report, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that, Tom. I can see that Councillor Johnson has raised his hand, so Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tom. I mean, obviously I've seen this report previously at Corporate Performance and Resources. I'm really just looking to touch on Appendix B, which is your action plan, for which I think you're responsible for many of the actions. And most of them are dated March or April of this year, which is obviously this month and next month. So I'm just clarifying your time frame and completion of those responsibilities and actions. Thank you, Chair. Tom.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Yes, I looked at those as part of preparing for committee this evening, because obviously the action plan was prepared in the late summer of last year. I think the approach that we need to take is to consider those actions in the context of the proposals that Cabinet will consider, because they, whilst the Cabinet report will take forward all of those aspects, I think the timing may be slightly different on some of them, but substantively the reflection piece has been completed, and the arrangements for how we now go about the next phase of the transformational change programme will start to come into fruition over the next couple of months. So I would say that the essence of those actions will be completed. The proposals that we're looking to take to Cabinet are for a more exploratory and developmental programme over the next few months, so that we are able to kind of respond and develop the programme. And I think that's really what Audit Wales were looking for us to do in having a more wide-ranging programme that reflects priorities that are both resource-led but also outcomes-led as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Tom. Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a point on Appendix B, which is obviously the action plan. On P3 in particular, it talks about training and support to help staff develop the skills necessary. Now, obviously, I think that's very important, because this report and the subsequent report on leisure does identify areas of training needs. And I just wondered, perhaps, have we got the infrastructure ready to support this, considering an awful lot of officers will still be working remotely and not together with other people? And I just wonder, perhaps, have we got the necessary packages to do that adequately? And also, are other councils doing this as well? I take it that they are. And also, can we learn from them, or can we, in fact, join up with them to help each other?
Absolutely. Thank you, Councillor Wilson. In terms of training support, absolutely. Consideration of providing the necessary skills is fundamental to the success of delivering programmes like this. We've historically made a use of both internal training that's been provided through the Council's organisational development and training team. So on some of the core transformational skills, they are an excellent source of support, and we'll see some of that being reflected in the forthcoming workforce plan. We've also, in some of the other projects, sought specialist external support in terms of training and development for staff. So I'm thinking back to the establishment of the Big Fresh Catering Company, for example, where we brought in specific training and development for some of our colleagues in terms of some of the legal and financial aspects of those things. So I would foresee a mix of these things continuing, and absolutely the sharing of best practice, experience, skills, and just general having been through these kinds of things. Absolutely, there's a really strong collaborative working ethic within this part of Welsh local government. The council is a very active member of the continuous improvement community, which the WLGA chairs, and I regularly attend those, as do colleagues of mine. And we also make use of our professional networks as well, because the important thing, I think, for us to recognise, and certainly I hope this is reflected in the next iteration of the transformational change programme, is that actually this is a whole authority piece of work. This requires all of us to change. It's not just it's not a small core corporate team doing this. This is about linking how the whole organisation works in terms of our culture with the way that we want to work in the future and how we bridge the gap. So yeah, absolutely, those things are in progress.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Do we have any other questions or comments from members? Okay, well, in that case, if we note the report, then thank you, Tom, for that. As I said, we're going to move item 6 on leisure services to the end of the agenda. So if we move on to item 7 then, which is the Treasury Management and Investment Strategy.
Hello, good evening.
Evening, Gemma.
Good evening. Thank you for those of you that were able to attend the training with Link this afternoon. I was just going to start off by looking back at what's happened in 2021 in terms of the Treasury Management report. So borrowing has been quite static in the year. We've had limited maturities, and given there's been some slippage, understandably, on the capital programme, and also in the context of low investment returns, and at times very high cash balances, and relatively high level of reserves, we've continued our approach to internally borrow. So there's been no new borrowing in year, although we will be taking on some borrowing that's associated with the Salix investment funds around the carbon management schemes. We started the year only investing in local authorities and DMOs, so in terms of investments. But I think, as we indicated in the last Treasury Management Strategy, our intention was to look to adopt some additional investment tools, and we started to utilise some AAA rated money market funds via CCLA and Federated, and also we're utilising deposits with Lloyds. And the advantage of that approach is that given the low returns across the market, there are no transaction fees when we use the deposit accounts in Lloyds. Given the high levels of cash going through authorities this year, returns have been low, and investments in other local authorities have been quite difficult to secure, and they've been agreed quite far in advance. And we also need to consider that this in the context of some cash flow uncertainty this year. Our returns, given our risk adverse stance, are okay, but we are very much benefiting from some high local authority loans that were made at the start of the year. We would expect returns to be lower in 21-22. DMO has, which is an investment tool that we utilise and is investing with the central government, has gone negative on a number of occasions. But given the other investment tools open to us, we've been able to ensure that no negative investments have been made in 2021. A couple of other events that impact on our Treasury Management Strategy that occurred during 2021 are that we had the outcome of the P2LB consultation, which Adam touched on during the training earlier. no local authorities are able to borrow from PWLB for commercial purposes now. And following that move, this brought the rates of borrowing for general fund borrowing back down in line with the rate for HRA borrowing. Also, I think when we brought the last Treasury Management Strategy, we raised this issue around the implementation of the IFRS 16 leasing standard. And that was delayed because it was due to be implemented in April 2020. It was delayed due to COVID, and it's now been further delayed to April 2022. But we have been advised that it is happening and it won't be further delayed. So that's something that we've got. We haven't down tools in terms of making those changes, but following the implementation of that standard, we'll see leases come on the balance sheet as an asset and a corresponding liability, and that will very much change our Treasury Management Strategy figures going forward. So we'll see that reflected in the next Treasury Management Strategy. Looking beyond, so looking to 2021 and 21-22, I think the key tables in this report set out the capital financing requirement going from around 200 million to just over 280 million. In the context of this, we have reducing reserves and capital receipts, which impact our ability to comfortably internally borrow. And our current internal borrowing is around 45 million, and this strategy projects a fall to around 12 million, largely off the back of reducing reserves. We also have significant borrowing requirement for the capital programme. It's 115 million in this Treasury Management Strategy, particularly for HRA. So there's 81 million for HRA. It should be noted that the general fund element, 17 million of that is supported borrowing, so is in part funded by AEF, and 3.8 million of that is 21st century school debt, but that's been afforded by increased headroom because of the appropriation of existing debt to the HRA. We also have during this period nearly 38 million of maturities of our existing external borrowing. So you'll see a figure in the Treasury Management Strategy of around 150 million of borrowing in the next few years. We need to balance this against the expectation that interest rates are likely to stay relatively low, and that there may be some optimism associated with borrowing profiles. And in the context of the low investment returns and possible negative outlook, if we were to be borrowing in advance of need, this could be quite costly. So we need to keep that borrowing position under constant review in 21-22. But I think it's safe to say that we will certainly be looking to do some borrowing in 21-22, given the sizable borrowing over the next 5 years. As part of this report, we set an authorised limit, which is an absolute maximum, which will not be exceeded. And we also set an operational boundary, which should not, but may be in exceptional circumstances. We also set limits for fixed and variable rate borrowing, although we would expect to do fixed rate borrowing as part of this strategy, and we would normally expect to carry out our borrowing with PWLB. I should also note that I mentioned earlier around the change to the PWLB borrowing following the outcome of the consultation. There are also a number of reviews that are being undertaken, including a review of the Prudential Code, and that will look to set further standards of prudence in Treasury management and look to prevent borrowing for commercial purposes generally, as opposed to just via PWLB. So that's out for consultation at the moment, and we'll have to keep that under review as we proceed. In terms of investments, we expect to continue to use the tools utilised in 2021. So money market funds, lending to DMO, Lloyds and other local authorities. We may need to explore alternative deposit arrangements just to give us more flexibility. And one thing we might be considering is whether a notice account with a bank would work for us. Although we need to bear in mind that the uptick on return for that notice arrangement is relatively small. We are projecting a reduction in reserves, and therefore that will have an impact on reduced investment balances. But we need to keep that again under review in the context of uncertain cash flows. This report also sets out the minimum revenue provision policy, which is in paragraphs 2.31 to 2.43 of the report. in most cases for the general fund, we use the asset life method over 40 years. For HRA, we use 2%, but we expect to move to an asset life approach going forward. A key area in terms of investment management and treasury management for authorities is in terms of environmental, social and governance issues when making investments. So this is something that we're going to have to do more and more work around going forward in future treasury management strategies. If we look at what our investment management profile is, obviously a large proportion of that is with local authorities, and given that most have declared a climate emergency, in coming years, hopefully we'll be able to do some work around demonstrating that that is acceptable. In the context of this growing importance, we also have seen CCLA and Federated, the money market fund providers, doing a lot of work in this area. But we may need to place more emphasis on this area when agreeing new counterparties in the future. I just wanted to flag up one more thing. In the context of the increased HRA borrowing, we are also looking at increased number of PIs in respect of HRA, and that's something that we can look to see in future treasury management strategies. Okay, I'm happy to take any questions on that.
Councillor Wilson.
First of all, can I apologise for not making the treasury management training? First of all, I had other demands on my time, unfortunately. But there are a few points I'd like to consider. On page 26, on just above where it says creditworthiness, you talk about the council investment portfolios would be security first, portfolio liquidity second, and then yield third. I don't disagree for one moment about that. But what I wanted a bit more information in terms of profiling that going forward, because obviously one of the concerns that I have, and I'm sure many members also have the concerns of the world of negative interest rates, you know, of putting money in on deposit and actually paying for that money to be on deposit. And it's a real issue out there. And I wondered also, has the council considered perhaps being a lender, lending it itself to own some money to very secure organisations, and wonder have they considered that perhaps as part of an investment strategy, so actually lending out money to other parties, all right, in order to try and boost our yield, because clearly we may be okay this year and next year in terms of our finances, but going forward, I've read about other councils in England in particular. Leeds are facing £100 million saving this year. Other councils of similar sizes are facing huge savings. It's a real concern out there that, you know, in 2023, 2024, we could be facing big cuts to our revenues. And what we've got to do is trying to find ways of raising finance. And I think perhaps are we looking into those areas? Now, you may say that's risky, okay, and I understand why you might say that, given the situation that we're in. But we live in very difficult times, you know, and as, you know, Wasi Sunak will say on Wednesday, you know, that we are facing a black hole in the accounts of 260 billion at least. You know, that's not going to get any better. If anything, it's going to get worse. So I'm just wondering, perhaps, you know, what are we doing to think about not just now, but thinking 3 or 4 years down the line? I've also got a point making further on this in terms of the Cardiff Capital Region City deal as well. What I'm interested in is our return from our money. We got contribution of 2.24 million, but what return will we earn from City deal? That's the question I'm asking.
Okay.
Thank you.
If I could answer your first question first. So no, we haven't. We haven't considered lending to other organisations. I'm assuming we're talking about on a longer term, so on a 5-year or more basis.
Yes.
I think I certainly would have to do some work around this. But we'd have to be quite careful in terms of whether this is for a treasury management purposes, in terms of managing our cash and raising cash, or whether it's a policy decision. It's something that we want to be lending money to organisations from a regeneration point of view in terms of supporting businesses. So it depends what stance we take in terms of what approach. And then if it is a policy decision, then it might be that we'd need to earmark some funds in terms of ring fencing some reserves or putting aside some revenue funding. But it's certainly something that we could look at. But no, in terms of our existing treasury management strategy, it wouldn't comply with the strategy as it stands. And the organisations would need to meet the counterparty set out in the treasury management strategy unless we were going to change our attitude to risk. But it's something that I could do some work about if committee wanted me to. In terms of the City Deal point, the City Deal funding, we are borrowing to fund capital expenditure as part of our contribution to City Deal. So my understanding is that any return in terms of how City Deal are investing their money is being recycled within the City Deal fund. So there is no return to us in terms of directly in terms of City Deal. Obviously, that the impact of City Deal would be, you would hope that they would generate a return for the authority as a whole.
Chair, can I come back on that? Thank you, Chair. On the first point, I would be interested to see if there is any councils that are lending money out to other organisations. And I think you rightly made the point about us helping out businesses and other organisations, yes, but also as a member of the Audit Committee and Chair of Corporate Resources, we do need to look at how we can get some income as well from that. We can't be totally benevolent in that sense. I think we've got to look after the council as well financially, which I know we're doing a very good job, but I'm just thinking of the world that we are facing at the moment. And I think we've got to be thinking about some things we never even thought about, to be quite honest with you. The other point about City Deal, I think there is a piece of work that needs to be done, not necessarily by Audit Committee, but even by City Deal itself, actually, to look at, I know an awful lot of the money is going to the Metro project. I'm well aware of that, but also quite a lot of money is going on other projects as well. I'm aware of that. But equally, there should be some form of quantifiable return from this in terms of these projects. What do they generate in terms of jobs? What do they generate in terms of revenues? How can the council benefit in that way? And I think that's worth looking at. I know we're all making a financial commitment here, and obviously what some councils are making bigger financial commitment than ours, virtue of their population and their wealth. But clearly we need to be looking at that as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Councillor Wilson. If Gemma, you wanted to come back on any of that, feel free to. If not, I'll hand over to Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on Councillor Wilson's point, I think it's Environment and Regeneration that's the scrutiny committee that looks into the City Deal. So it'd be worth checking to see what reports they've had recently, or whether they've got information that would be helpful to answer that question. To move on back to tonight's points here. Thanks to was it Adam who gave the presentation earlier? It was a very comprehensive presentation this afternoon, the training session that we had. For an hour-long piece of work. There's an awful lot to unpack there, but I thought that was also very helpful in taking us through the massive information regarding our treasury management. I think there's a couple of points that came that were interest to me from that and from the papers. The first is is that there really isn't that much out there in terms of being able to get a quick return on investments, and looking for somewhere to put that. I thought it was very interesting discussing the the limited, in levels of interest available, the cost of borrowing, and the usefulness of our under borrowing or our internal investment, which I think is interesting in the context of our reserves, what we've got and what we are likely to have in future. I think it's worth reminding ourselves, as Gemma said in her presentation, that the overwhelming majority of our new borrowing is actually for the housing revenue account. So that's going into, that's an investment in our housing and services, and that shouldn't be forgotten when you hear big figures about, about our borrowing rising quite substantially. There's a revenue stream which is attached to that. People are paying, will be paying their rent into that system. That's why we have 30-year housing program, which this is part of. If I'm misunderstanding this, then Gemma, please let me know, because that's obviously 70% of the 81 million is, of the 150 million, 70% plus of the new borrowing that we're facing. I was just looking to get a little bit of clarification on some of the terminology, because there's a lot of jargon thrown around. So 17 million of our new borrowing is in the general capital funding supported borrowing. So I'm just checking where that's coming from. I've heard reference to the local government borrowing initiative from Welsh Government. Is that the same thing, or are they two different things? Which, where does that operate? Also, just a little clarification. We've got one of our loans, 2.1 million. Has been paid back within the last 12 months. I'm just checking because we have a lot of loans here, and because they get refinanced, sometimes you lose track of where these things are. I'm just checking, is that the Barry Island Link Road borrowing that we've paid back to Welsh Government, which is that 2.1 million that's gone out of that? Can you just quickly just clarify the source of the general capital funding supported borrowing for me, and if that's not the same thing as the LGBI, what does the LGBI do? That's highways and stuff, and what does then the general capital come from? Thank you, Gemma.
LGBI and supported borrowing are similar in that they're both supported by a revenue stream. So the supported borrowing, the general capital funding supported borrowing, is part of our capital allocation from Welsh Government, and it's so we're supported to go out and borrow to fund capital expenditure, but then it's funded via a revenue stream. So theoretically, there's an allocation within our SSA and our funding from Welsh Government, so our AEF, our revenue support grant,
Can I cut across just to clarify that then? Okay, so where it says that we're borrowing £17 million, that's money that Welsh Government has allocated for us to spend on that borrowing.
Yes, absolutely.
Just basically, so we've got a total capital program borrowing, or new borrowing in this case, which is around 115 million. 81 million that is HRA. So we're borrowing essentially to build and develop our housing stock, and we will receive income from the residents of that. And we are receiving 17 million from Welsh Government in order to facilitate other things as well. Am I understanding that correctly?
We receive the revenue cost of borrowing it, so we have to borrow it, but we are receiving the revenue cost, so that the cost of MRP and interest on that borrowing we receive through our Welsh Government funding each year.
Okay, do we have any further questions or comments? Mr. Lewis.
Yes, Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to come back on this. I just reflected on what Councillor Johnson just said now about £2.1 million loan or something to do a Barry Island Link Road. These are significant amounts of money. And yet, as a lay member on this committee, as I'm trying to reinforce the point I made earlier, I've never heard of the Barry Island Link Road scheme. So, how would a lay member possibly know these things were going on? It just reinforces what I said earlier, that, if you're going to be the lay member and the chairman of an audit committee, You need a much bigger remit than a lay member gets at the moment to understand what is going on within the council. And I thank you, Councillor Johnson, for mentioning this, because I'd never heard of it. Okay?
If you don't mind, Chair, I'll just come back quickly. I think it is. We have. I mean, within here, there's millions and millions and millions of pounds of capital expenditure that, if you didn't know, you wouldn't know. I think you have to be on top of an awful lot of what goes on in the council to understand all of these things. The Barry Link Road, I mean, most people will be quite familiar with it by now. It's for the Millennium aspect that runs up to the junction with Plymouth Road and sort of onto the island. And then Welsh Government lent us I believe, I'm going to look at Gemma to correct me, but they lent us £2 million to do that road without any interest attached to it, because it was considered to be such an important part of the development that otherwise wouldn't happen, and therefore it was lent to us for a period of time, probably 5 years, which has recently elapsed, and why we've paid it back. But apart from coverage at the time in the newspapers of Welsh Government gives council loan, I don't think you'd have seen it anywhere else in the last 5 years.
Well,
Chair, if I might.
If I may, Chair, I mean, it just goes to illustrate that as a lay member, how out of touch you can be with what goes on within the other committees. And, I'm just stressing the point, really, that the lay member is going to find it very difficult to keep tabs on what's going on within the council, because it's the only committee that I attend. I've been on this committee for 10 years, and there are only 4 or 5 meetings a year normally. And to try and keep tabs on what's going on within the council is virtually impossible. I just use this as an example of trying to demonstrate how inadequate I would feel if I was asked to be a chairman.
Okay, I'm not sure whether that's really something for Gemma to comment on, but I'm sure it will be noted, Paul, and perhaps anybody who looks at the minutes for the last agenda item, or agenda item 4, would be well advised to read the minutes for this section as well. But do we have any other questions or comments from members? Well, if I could just take us back then, Gemma, to the point Councillor Wilson was raising with regard to investment strategy and returns. I recall, I don't remember the dates exactly, but I think it must have been around this time 2 years ago when we did the training, and the council were then looking as though a move to a riskier investment strategy was something that was being looked at quite favourably. My question is a broad one, but it's, has the pandemic in any way changed the council's views on that, and if so, in what way?
Chair, I think in terms of the pandemic, I think we had strategies to move to money market funds in train prior to the pandemic, and in fact we were delayed moving across to it because we were tied up with other issues at the start of the pandemic. The use of a number of investment tools has proved invaluable to us over the last few months, and I think we, particularly in the context of negative investment rates in DMO, and the use of deposit accounts with Lloyds, and potentially looking for further deposit accounts, has been in part required because we have been dealing with such high cash balances at relatively short notice, but that we needed to keep liquid to then pay back out. So I think there, part of it is something that we were looking to implement anyway, and and has been really useful during the pandemic and the corresponding impact on the economy. And there are other elements of the strategy that have developed as a result of the unique cash position that we've been in as a result of the pandemic, if that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gemma. I wasn't suggesting you bring Neil Woodford in to cover them. But do we have any other questions or comments? Okay, well, if we move on to the recommendations then, just bear with me while I get to the page. There are a lot written out on the page, so rather than read through them all, are we all content to take the recommendations as written? I will take that as a yes. Thank you for that, Gemma.
Thank you very much.
If we move on to item 8 then, which is the corporate risk register.
I promise this is my last item of the evening for you, committee. So yes, this is the Q3 update of the risk register. So this is the register as at the end of December 2020. I mentioned at committee last time that we were looking at the risk register that some of the corporate risks are clearly moving at a much quicker pace. So the covering report gives the latest information regarding both coronavirus and Brexit as at the date they were published. It's worth noting that the position on coronavirus has further changed since the publication of the papers, with today's official figures for the Vale of Glamorgan being 49.4 cases per 100,000 of the population, with a positivity rate of 5.2%. The report, as usual, gives you an overview of the movement against the corporate risks which are on the register. There's, as I say, a significant update in terms of coronavirus, flagging the fact that Wales entered another national lockdown towards the end of the quarter, and also reflecting the fact that the vaccination programme is moving at a pace with 145,000 people in Cardiff and the Vale having now received their vaccines as at yesterday. The report also gives some context and an update in terms of Brexit, some information in terms of disruptions to trade flows, and also the trading negotiations with other countries and the arrangements that are being put in place there. So it gives you as much of an up-to-date picture as we can do. In terms of the register overall, Chair, the one risk that is increased on the quarter is the welfare reform risk. That's moved from scoring a 4 to 6. It remains medium, but the impact of coronavirus is seeing an increase in demand for services associated with welfare reform, so claimants for universal credit, etc. The forecast direction of travel, again, are included within the report, and overall 71% of the actions associated with mitigating corporate risks are either on track or completed, but 22% of those actions have slipped. There's an exceptions report in section 6 of the report for committee members to consider the reason for slippages against those actions, with the majority citing the impact of the pandemic. So that gives you a very brief overview, and I don't know whether members have got questions about specific aspects of the register that I can try and field for you.
Councillor Wilson. You're on mute, Mark.
I've got a few points, sorry. Page 17, why 5 years for a workforce plan? Why 5 years? Why not 2 years? Why not 1 year? That's the first question. Second question is regarding South Lodge on page 37. When we're going to have planning going to take place in terms of South Lodge? I know we've got the agreement sorted with Fablas, I think it is, and I just wondering where we are in terms of planning therefore on that. The other consideration I also got is on the additional learning needs bill, and that's why I declare my interest of being a Cardiff and Vale College, because we have to work with FEIs over this, but it is a serious issue for the council, especially since there is an appeal process that could take place. And I just wondered, perhaps, have we got everything in place for that, considering the legislation should be enacted from September this year? And I just wondered, perhaps, have we got an update? Obviously, I'm not on the Lifelong Learning Scrutiny Committee, but I wondered, perhaps, have they received anything? No. I've also got other questions, but I think what I'll probably do for you, Tom, in all fairness to you, is email them across to you so you can answer them in your own time. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. In terms of the ALN bill, I'll certainly find out some further information. That's not an area that I'm familiar enough with to give you an update. My apologies. In terms of South Lodge, you're right. In terms of the lease is going through the legal process currently. So that's the current state of play in terms of South Lodge in Penarth. And the reason for the workforce plan being a 5-year document, it is the workforce strategy, which will also contain an element of the action plan. So the reason for reflecting it on a 5-year time horizon is in acknowledgement of some of the issues we were talking about in terms of reshaping earlier, and the points that you raised about skills, experience and development for staff. So it's really looking at that 5-year horizon to bridge the gap between where are we now, what skills and roles do we need in the 5-year time horizon. But I can reassure you that the sort of annual year-on-year workforce requirements are reflected within individual service plans, and those audit committee members who are also members of scrutiny committees will this month be seeing the service plans which set out how those aspects will be progressed. So that, I hope that covers those 3 questions, and obviously feel free to email any follow-up ones.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tom, for the report. I think I don't think there'd be any disagreement regarding some of the higher rated risks, COVID, Brexit, and knock-on effects on welfare reform. I wanted to highlight 2 areas which are also here but not in here, if that makes sense. So the first one is regarding environmental sustainability, and in particular flooding in the Vale. There is reference here in terms of the exception reports to implementation of the Llan Maes scheme, but it's really a more general concern. Obviously, we had flooding, as you know, before Christmas. It's been reported to Cabinet, reported to the Environment and Regeneration Committee. I think that's it's just an area that's where the impact is so substantial upon those who are affected that it reflects it's an increasingly likely and has high impact. So how we want to reflect that within our corporate risk register, I think, would be useful to reflect upon, and in terms of the actions going forward and how that fits in with departmental priorities, etc. The other is slightly more specific, but it's reported within our exception reporting here, which is on additional learning needs for Welsh language pupils. I mean, I've had this reported to me from parents and from RAG, Rhieni dros Addysg Gymraeg, regarding our ability to provide levels of support to Welsh language people, Welsh language first speakers with additional learning needs, which has meant that they've they have to go out of county for support, and that's had knock-on effects during the pandemic, for example, where I've had to step in with regards to providing training and transport, because what should be provided to them within the Vale is not provided to them within the Vale, and sometimes that message hasn't quite got across, not necessarily within the education department, but to other departments that provide support. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. And with your permission, Chair, perhaps when we bring the risk register back to your next committee meeting, we can do what we did earlier on in 2020, where I brought a couple of my service colleagues along who've got a much greater level of service knowledge about those aspects. And perhaps we could focus in on the query from Councillor Wilson and Councillor Johnson in terms of ALM, picking up both the implementation of the legislation, but also the specific impacts that we've seen on those students learning in Welsh. And in terms of the environmental sustainability risk, I can ask a colleague to attend the committee on that risk, but I'll certainly undertake, Councillor Johnson, to ask one of the performance partners who does the updates with the heads of service to look specifically at how flooding and water management is reflected within that risk, and to, as you say, based on the weather we had just before and then just after Christmas, make sure that the rating of that risk is at an appropriate level.
Thank you for that, Tom. Do we have any other questions or comments? Okay, if we move on to the recommendations then, if first of all we note the position and refer members' comments to Cabinet for consideration, I think we can all agree on that one. And if we move on to our next item then, which is item 9, progress against the audit risk plan.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. Yes, I'd like to take you through this report that sets out the progress that has been made against the agreed annual internal audit plan. Appendix A illustrates that 21 reviews have been finalised, 14 with an audit opinion, whilst 2 audits are in draft. 23 audits are ongoing and 2 are due to commence shortly. Of the 14 completed audits to date, 5 have had a substantial assurance opinion, 8 a reasonable opinion, and 1 a limited opinion. That means that only limited assurance can be placed on the internal controls of that specific service. As detailed in the report, this limited assurance audit was a review of direct payments within social services. Audit Committee can see that this was the 4th audit that this area that had been undertaken in this area since June 2018. And whilst progress to make improvements has been slow, and this has also been delayed due to the impact of COVID-19, it should be noted that all recommendations have been agreed by management and they are planned to be completed and implemented by June 2021. As per our process, a follow-up review will then be undertaken to ensure that the recommendations have been implemented and are working effectively. Appendix A also illustrates that 34 medium or significant recommendations have been made to improve the control environment. And as I've just explained, these are monitored to ensure they have been implemented. Finally, although some services are still under intense pressure and some planned audits have been rearranged to accommodate this, it is pleasing to note that many of the planned audits have been allocated and it appears that sufficient coverage will be completed by the year end to form an overall audit opinion. I'm happy to take any questions.
Do we have any questions or comments? Okay, nice and easy one then, Joan. If we note the report and move on to our next item, which is the self-assessment, I believe. Apologies.
Sorry.
Oh, it's Mark.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Mark.
Sorry, Chair. I was talking away and I hadn't unmuted myself. Apologies for that. Yes, members can see on page there, the purpose of the report is to summarise for members of the Audit Committee for the findings of the self-assessment of good practice from the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy Practical Guidance 2018. You can see there on the summary the progress made. Oops, wrong one. The effectiveness of the Audit Committee has been reviewed in line with the Charter Institute of Public Finance self-assessment of good practice. The overall effectiveness was found to be good, with a few areas having recommendations for improvement, and the skills and knowledge self-assessment questionnaire has been developed for members of the Audit Committee to consider. So really, this report is an opportunity for members to consider and comment on the report, and including the checklist, the comments in the checklist in Appendix A, and the recommendations in Appendix B, and also the questionnaire that I just mentioned, which is in Appendix C. The report covers the background, which I've covered already briefly, and a member of the audit team has independently gone through the terms of reference and the operation of the audit committee and tried to answer the questions in the checklist, and that is shown in detail in Appendix A, as I referred to. So there's a number of points there, a number of positive aspects that we've identified, but there are some areas that for consideration in terms of for the audit committee, which are covered in paragraph 2.2. Those areas are the production of an annual report on the work of the committee, including obtaining feedback on its performance. That's one thing for consideration. Consideration should be given to consolidating the terms of reference, purpose and role of the audit committee into one section of the constitution, and we're taking the opportunity to do at least part of that because we're obviously updating the terms of reference to reflect the Local Government and Election Wales Act that we spoke about earlier on in the meeting this evening. A training needs assessment for members should be undertaken, and that's hopefully members will consider positively and completing the questionnaire that's at Appendix C, and we can circulate that electronically if members agree to that. And the committee consider evaluating whether and how it is adding value, and an action plan is then developed to address any identified weaknesses. I wasn't going to go into much more detail than that, but happy to take members' comments and questions and so on. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Can I thank Mark for this report? I think it's really good, and I think it does highlight the areas of strengths and areas where perhaps we need to develop a bit more work on. I think one of the areas, I have discussed this before when I was chair of the audit committee, was the terms of reference, and I think that needs to be much more accessible as a working document to members of the audit committee, so that people really buy into the terms of reference and use the coverage of it, so they understand what they can and cannot look at, to be quite honest. And obviously, we've got a great opportunity now with the new Local Government Act to revisit it again with governance. I think what we've got to be careful as members, by calling it governance, we've got to be careful we don't go into areas that belong to other committees like the Democratic Committee, and also the one that I'm chair of, which never meets, and touchwood it never does meet, I'm saying, the Investigatory Committee as well. And I think that is something that we do need to look at going forward. In terms of having using I like the implementation plan, but the questionnaire you got on here at the end on Appendix C is a good one, but I would like it perhaps, if you want members to engage fully in it, perhaps maybe we could do it on Microsoft Forms. I think it's a very good way of collating the information for officers afterwards as well, and it's a good way of using it because you can then tabulate it very well via a spreadsheet. And I just wondered that maybe we could consider looking at in that way. I also think perhaps, we need to highlight the any comments bit so that people can make comments to signify whether they got reasonable, limited or no knowledge as well. Because I think a lot of members would be reluctant to say I have reasonable knowledge rather than limited. And I think that's a discussion we could have about certain words, because limited could mean, is that adequate? Do you have adequate knowledge? Or do you have good knowledge, rather than using the words reasonable and limited? I think if you move that limited perhaps to the right and say limited stroke no knowledge, I think no knowledge, difficult one, I think we all got some knowledge. So I think certain words could be looked at and could possibly change to demonstrate a bit more confidence in what we are doing better. You know, I'm well aware doing lesson observations and observing other people. Sometimes the language is not that great, and I think we've got to be careful here as well of using perhaps better language to reflect our capabilities and abilities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Councillor Wilson. Mark, if you want to come back on any of that, if not.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Yeah, actually, we've tried this question. It'll be the third time we'll have used it. It was developed for Rhondda Cynon Taf initially. Bridgend have rolled it out, and the point that Councillor Wilson makes about being able to complete the form electronically as opposed via email. That's what we did in Rhondda Cynon Taf and Bridgend. We sent it out via email. I'd have to look into who could develop something for us in the Vale in terms of. I'm sure it can be done. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Certainly we can look at that. But what I wouldn't want to do is sort of delay circulating the questionnaire if members are agreeable to do so. But obviously we can look at that. Yeah, quite happy to look at the sort of language in the questionnaire as it is in terms of a reasonable knowledge. I think you felt that was okay if I followed you correctly. It was the limited knowledge and the no knowledge, whether we can combine that and come up with something around some knowledge as the middle sort of question. Certainly I'm more than happy to tweak the questionnaire in that respect. And your point around the terms of reference, yes, perhaps we should bring the terms of reference back to a future audit committee once it's been updated to sort of remind everybody what the detail that's in there. I think that would be a useful thing to do. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair Mark. Just quickly, obviously the new legislation gives an opportunity or an impetus behind some of this, as Councillor Wilson's already said. I'm just wondering, in terms of actions, in terms of what you do next, I mean, what happened as a result of the undertaking this survey in RCT and in Bridgend?
In RCT, what we've started to do is develop a training program, essentially, or a training raising awareness sort of program over the coming 12 months for members based on the answers that they gave. So that's something that we're developing with colleagues in Rhondda Cynon Taf. It's not just about internal audit; it's with external colleagues, as finances, other aspects of the authority as well. Bridgend, we are currently analysing the results of the survey, so anticipate doing something similar, and likewise that's what I would think would be the sensible way forward for the Vale if members are in agreement.
Okay, thank you for that. Do we have any other questions or comments? Okay, if we move on to the recommendations then, firstly to consider the findings and then for all of us as members of the committee to complete the questionnaire. I think we can all agree on those. And if we move on to the forward work programme then.
Yes, thank you. That's me. This report again is a standard report that provides members with an updated forward work programme for 2021-22. As you're aware, this forward work programme assists committee in ensuring that due consideration is given to all aspects of its core functions as set out in its terms of reference. Appendix A is the current updated forward work programme. Please note that the next meeting is provisionally listed as May, with another in July, and this will ensure that the statement of accounts meets statutory timescales. Therefore, the forward work programme is currently under review to ensure items are achievable within the timescales, as well as the requirement for it to be updated to reflect the changes required under the Local Government and Elections Act. So although you'll see a forward work programme there for the next sort of 12 months or so, it's likely that it will be adjusted to fit those timescales and the new requirements of the Act. Just picking up on a previous point as well, the terms of reference is actually listed to be brought to the committee in the next meeting, May 2021. And I'm happy to take any other questions. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Yes, if we go back to the minutes on page 368 at the bottom, the last paragraph says, in considering the forward work programme, Mr. Anthony Veal, who's here today, requested for the audit statement of accounts to be considered by the committee in February. I just wondered why it's not on the agenda.
Shall I take that one? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the timetable for the closure of the accounts has been discussed, and it's been reverted back to the timetable as was in last financial year. So that's why the timescales have to be changed again to revert back to the July meeting. The accounts won't be completed and brought to committee at the earlier date that was originally sort of muted prior.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Chair. I'm not quite sure that's the correct answer. That's the right answer to the wrong question, if that makes sense. The 1920 figures were the ones.
That's what we're looking at. 1920 accounts.
We had some queries about an additional council meeting, and they've not been brought back to this committee. I think that's the point that council.
That's the point. It's 1920.
Yeah, not the so not the next.
Oh, sorry,
2021. It's last year's, and we had some queries about it that were still outstanding at the time. They were agreed by full council, and I'm assuming that's what Councillor Wilson's referring to.
I think it was the two queries by members of the public, wasn't it, at the time?
I just had a separate query about the forward work programme, which I don't know if Joan's the right person to ask, but according to the Vale Council website, we've got a meeting on April the 12th. Have I misread that? And then the next meeting's in June. Is that right? Or I've missed an update somewhere?
Chair, perhaps I could respond to Councillor Johnson's query there. No, you are correct. There is a timetabled meeting for April, and if the chair agrees, we'd be looking to cancel that meeting and have the meeting in May, because if I remember correctly, this meeting was due to be held in February, and it was put back to the 1st of March to accommodate certain reports to make sure they were available. So it's subject to the chair's agreement. We won't have a meeting in April, but we'll have a meeting in May, and then the next meeting will be in July.
Okay, Steve, I can see you wanted to come in on that, and then Councillor Wilson.
Yes, please. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just thought I'd respond really in regard to the closure of the 1920 account. It's a good opportunity to give you a quick update in regard to that. So thank you, Councillor Wilson. Members will recall there was 2 items of correspondence, one of which we've looked at. The work is complete. We've responded to the individual concerned. That individual had a 28-day right of appeal, a statutory right of appeal, and that period is now elapsed. So that matter is pretty much now closed. The second one, work is still ongoing with help from internal audit colleagues, and that's been agreed with the individual concerned. So we can't yet conclude on this, but as I understand it from my recent discussions with Mark and internal audit colleagues, that work is progressing well, and we hope to be able to respond shortly. So maybe by the time of the next audit committee in May, we should be in a position to have closed the 1920 audit.
Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I just thought, I spent a lot of time reading the minutes and the agendas this time, and I found that, and I was thinking, where is it on the forward work programme? And thank you for answering that, because it is a point that external auditors looked at, and going forward we do need to address that. I just wondered, perhaps, is there anything we could do in terms of the Constitution, perhaps, or even audit terms of reference, so we don't have these problems going forward in the future? I'd just be grateful for your comments on that, Steve, in particular.
Yes, it's obviously something that was on my radar, and I've made a note to sort of mention this at some time during the committee anyway. So it's not something that would slip by virtue of the fact it's not on the work programme. But yes, I suppose it would be good practice to keep track of it and put that maybe on the work programme. As it might be something you might want, committee members might think is useful to have a formal update on that at the next committee meeting, for example. We, as I say, we don't know where we're going to be landing at that particular point in time in terms of concluding on the matters concerned. but certainly we can give you an update on the position.
I would like that anyway as a committee member.
Yeah. Chair, perhaps I could add to that. One of the things that we do at one or two of the audit committees is you actually identify different external audit reports or inspection reports as we know them at a point in time. So obviously they can change and so on. I think we tend to in the Vale we just have a one-liner, so it may be helpful. We can identify specific reports when we know when they're due to come forward in the future. So that may assist in this regard as well. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Chair. I don't want to labour the point, but obviously I think it is, as Councillor Wilson's pointed out, I think it's quite important that we have something to say that we have seen the end results of the 2019-2020 figures. I mean, we did have quite a heated discussion about it last September. We had a debate about it in full council in October. I think it's right and proper for our audit trail, as well as your audit trail, that it comes back to this this committee, because that's what we were told it would happen, isn't it?
Just to say, if I may, Chad, I totally agree with the comments being raised by members, and yes, we'll provide that update accordingly.
Okay, with there being no further questions or comments, if we could note the work programme and endorse it. Are we all content with that? Fantastic. And if we move back up the agenda then to item 6 and the review of leisure services.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair. Obviously, this is a reference from the Healthy Living and Social Care Scrutiny Committee. I appreciate you putting it to the rear of the agenda, and there are reasons for that that we may need to share later on. Obviously, the report from the Welsh Audit Office in terms of our leisure services was very, very encouraging. Subsequent to that report, we have done some further research because we were challenged in terms of our value for money in terms of what our service was actually providing. We have shared some data that we've been able to obtain from other authorities now, which was shared with Samantha Clements from the Welsh Audit Office in terms of where we are actually performing with our contract arrangements. And I'm very pleased to say that we appear to be the only authority in Wales that is actually getting a revenue return in terms of its leisure centres. When you actually also look at the prices that we're charging to use our particular facilities, we are amongst the lowest if you look at sort of core activities. And the two core activities we chose to look at were an adult swim non-member and also the direct debit for regular gym membership. And as I say, we were very much at the lower end of those particular charges. We've also taken on board in the action plan, which is obviously appended to the report, the recommendations made by Welsh Audit Office in other areas. What I do need to report to committee, which I couldn't actually report to scrutiny committee at the time, was the joint funded post that you see was the first thing that we were looking to implement with the Health Board, which the Health Board have kindly provided some funding for. We did advertise that post on a part-time basis, but sadly the level of application we had wasn't to the required standard. We subsequently identified some further funding from Sport Wales that actually turns that into a full-time post, which we will be advertising this week or next, as soon as the next bulletin is available of posts within the local authority. And we're obviously hoping as a full-time post that will attract a higher calibre of applicant and we'll actually be able to fill this post on this particular occasion. What I would say, and I think the report does delve into this a little bit, that obviously health and well-being is a very important area of the council's works, particularly in terms of COVID, particularly taking pressure off the health services, hopefully in the future. Obviously, we're in an extremely unusual time with our facilities actually being closed at the moment, and that's a real shame given the investment that the council has made into these facilities in recent times. We've got new changing rooms, new dry changing rooms ready to open in Barry. The wet changing rooms that were open in Barry were only open for a short period of time, so again they will see new. The new floor in Barry Leisure Centre has been laid during this particular close down and looks particularly good for anybody that has seen images. Obviously, the changing suites in Penarth were just about open prior to lockdown, but lots of exciting things happening, improvements made in both Cowbridge and Lantwit Major as well. I'm quite happy to take any questions at this point, Chair.
Do we have any questions or comments? I'll take that as a no, so feel free to carry on.
I do.
Oh, Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, for some reason, the hand up function doesn't always work unless we're putting that to democratic. Okay. Just a few things here. Can I thank you for your report, Dave? I mean, obviously, there are a few issues here, and I think we've got to bear in mind the context here. We have been dealing with a pandemic, and, you know, and I think, and also that leisure, a considerable period of time being shut down, really, and it's therefore very difficult to make progress in lots and lots of areas, especially in regard to fitness and the 5 ways of working. I think the 5 ways of working is a useful exercise, which perhaps maybe we could recommend that we have training on the 5 ways of working. I think not just for audit committee members, but for all members of the council and maybe officers as well, come to think of that, because I do think that is an area where perhaps, you know, if external audit is saying we should be looking at the 5 ways of working, then clearly we should be doing so. Rather than playing lip service to it, we should be actually really embracing it going forward, especially with the links with the Future Generations Act. And I think that is somewhere where perhaps we can make a recommendation here. There's a few points I want to make as well. On 2.8, it talks about the Insight Board Tracker. I just wondered perhaps what does that really mean? And, you know, and do we have a role in audit committee by examining the Insight Board Tracker? Okay. Also on this subscript, you've got a report on subscript here, which is the footer. And can we see that report as well? That would be useful. I've got some other points to make, but I wouldn't mind the other members perhaps joining in a bit later as well.
On that, I can see that Tom has his hand up there as well, so I'm not sure if there was anything you wish to add on that point, Tom.
It was I thought it'd be useful to respond to Councillor Wilson's points around the 5 ways of working training, and I think members will remember that we did an induction programme following the previous local authority election. And that included aspects of Future Generations, but it probably is actually a really good opportune time now that we're about to launch our new annual delivery plan, which is rooted within the Future Generations Act, and how the 5 ways of working can work in practice. Now that we're a few years into that legislation, it might be really useful if we took that away and looked at how best we could support members in terms of their skills and knowledge on that. So I can certainly take that particular issue away. And in terms of the Insight Tracker, my apologies, that is a bit of jargon for audit committee. As committee will be aware, you receive an update at month 6 and then at the end of the year about all of the regulatory report recommendations and proposals for improvement, to give you an overview of where we are on each of those. Every month the Insight Board meets and we discuss progress against each of them. So for example, in this case, the action plan that Dave has just described, and equally the action plan that I was describing for reshaping earlier, we monitor that on a monthly basis at the board, which is chaired by the managing director, to make sure that there's a really tight focus on each of those recommendations being taken forward.
Do we have any other questions or comments at this point, or if not, I will invite Dave to continue. Dave, the floor is yours.
Right, Chair. Councillor Wilson referred to another report, and obviously we're happy to share any information with members. I can arrange for that to be forwarded on as such, so no issue there at all. I think that probably covers the questions that have been asked to date.
Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, can I go into other areas of the report now? And in terms of the actual detailed report, okay, from external auditor, on page 9 of 16, we talk about must comply with the equality duty under the Equality Act 2010. It says the council should consider what else it can do to involve all sectors of the community and better target and encourage those of greatest need to participate. And I'm just wondering, perhaps, there's two areas I was thinking of the 9 protected characteristics are we working on. That's for people who are disabled, and I know we do the exercise referral scheme, but not everyone is covered through that who happen to be disabled. And I wonder, perhaps, are we looking at other areas of disability? Those perhaps who have sight issues in particular, I was thinking about, and trying to make sure our leisure services, not just our leisure centres, but what we all provide, is more accessible for those particular groups. And also the other thing is in terms of ethnic minorities as well. I know that certain groups may want to do swimming on their own, as it were, as you know, without men, for example. And I wondered, perhaps, if we are looking at that, are we doing more on that? I know we do some of that, but I wondered, perhaps, do we do more and do we engage with those communities more? Can I then go on to page 11 of 16 in the report? Can we look at the data Cymru data? I noticed that between 2016-17 to 2017-18, there's a big jump in the figures. And I just wondered, why is that? Is that because we collect the data differently, or is that because Legacy Leisure has done such a wonderful job that we got more and more people going to our leisure centres? The discussion paper, which I know Dave referred to, was the interactive tool. Is it possible we could have access to this or look at that? Also, on page 13 of 16, okay, you talk about long term. Okay, you say we need what long term means. What does long term means? It's a good question. You know, if I look at it from an accountancy perspective, it's often more than 5 years. I'd just be interested to see, that's the 5 words working. This may be a point for Tom or anyone else. Is that the same, or is that over 3 years? I mean, 5 years for us, it's always another council period, isn't it? You know, and we have elections. So most members can't think beyond more than 5 years, to be quite honest with you. Although I think most of us are probably thinking in about a year's time. In terms of the action plan on Appendix B, okay, I think it's a very good action plan. The only point I have is in relation to PF1 at the bottom, near the bottom. Seek to engage further with social services and education to ensure leisure centre services are reaching key targets. The question I'm going to ask is, what are the key targets? And that's it. Thank you.
Dave.
Sorry, I've been scribbling away there during that. So if I miss anything, please do come back to me. If I deal with the Equality Act, first of all, obviously it's a very important element of our work, and we're very conscious of our responsibilities in trying to make the whole community active and provide opportunities as far as possible. The council does employ a specialist disability officer, which I think Councillor Wilson is probably aware of. And obviously we do look to involve that particular officer in activities in the leisure centre, but the leisure centres themselves and Legacy Leisure take this particular part of the specification and something that they need to meet, and it is regularly reported in the annual report. And I would refer members to the annual report that was presented to the last scrutiny committee, the last relevant scrutiny committee on that. Councillor Wilson also raised about single-sex sessions. We do have some single-sex sessions, notably, or we did have when we were open, notably a women's swimming hour in Barry Leisure Centre. We are there to respond to demand, and the reality of having the contract that we have in place, sometimes we need to identify, and Legacy Leisure have been very positive in this respect in terms of if there is a demand for certain activities which are very targeted in their particular delivery, they are very receptive to providing those particular activities. In terms of the figures, yes, there is an increase, and it isn't so much in the way that we collect the figures, it's more in what we've actually been counting and using. The performance indicator isn't solely about leisure centres, and in the past we had difficulty collecting data from bowls clubs, from park runs, from other leisure facilities, notably outdoor sports, etc., to include in our performance figure. And we had been criticised in the past that our performance figures were lower than other authorities and our participation levels were. So we did make a concerted effort to ensure that we were counting everybody that is using our facilities or using council leisure facilities. In some ways, I wish there was a specific performance indicator related only to leisure centres. And again, we would like to see a sort of subsidy per head indicator for leisure centres as such, because we're reasonably confident we would finish top of such a league table. But at the moment, the statistics are what they are and what we're actually asked to provide nationally. And I'm pleased to say with the counting that we are doing, we are now a top 3 performer across Wales overall. But as I say, I think the performance could be even better if we were just to look purely at leisure centres. In terms of the action plan, I'm taking a note. Was it page 13? Page 13 of 16, a query was raised. If I could just remind myself what that was. That was the long-term, short-term aspects of our work.
Yeah, do you want me to remind you today on Appendix B?
Well, shall I start with long-term, short-term? And as you say, Tom may wish to add something. Obviously, the council did take a long-term sort of decision when it let the contract to Legacy Leisure. It was a 10+5-year contract. We are obviously exploring the contract extension as we speak, and there will be reports going forward to Cabinet, hopefully in the not too distant future, in terms of extensions and where we go. Some members will be aware that the extension was agreed prior to COVID, but obviously the circumstances and the financial arrangements that were in place for that particular deal are no longer valid. So there is the need to carry on talking to Legacy and also to explore other opportunities that may exist. And obviously reports will be coming forward in due course about those. So I think as a council, we can take some pride in the fact that we did undertake long-term planning, but I take on board what's now said by Welsh Audit Office in this particular report. And again, I would say that we are actually doing that, and we are looking beyond the length of this contract, and that will be explored in future reports. As regards the action plan, Councillor Wilson, if I look about the part about working with social services and education, I think that's the admittance in the report that we can always do more. Some of our staff work very, very closely with social services in terms of those that are in most particular need or where we can be of most assistance, and not just in leisure centres, across the whole service. I'm particularly proud of some of the work that we've done in play recently in terms of respite care and that type of thing. Obviously, we do have sports development officers that go into school, and that's an opportunity to sell our services outside of schools, etc. But I think there's always a recognition we could be doing more in that area, and we're keen to do so. I hopefully have covered all the points there.
You have. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, well, in that case, if we consider the findings from Audit Wales review and the Council's response, forgive me, this wasn't our report. If we note it and take members' recommendations on board, Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, I was just going to say about the 5 ways of working. I think if we can make a specific recommendation about that, so there is training to be undertaken for members and possibly officers as well, although it's up to obviously the CMT to do that, to look into do that, prior to the closure of council in 2022. I think it would be useful if we could have it maybe perhaps this summer to look at it, so that members are well versed in the Future Generations Act and the 5 ways of working, especially in the context of audit committee members and the wishes of external audit. And I think that's important as well, to get an understanding of what external audit would like from us.
Okay, I'm not sure if anybody wishes to come.
Sorry, Chair, can I just interject there, Councillor
Yes,
Wilson?
sure.
Councillor Wilson, your recommendation is pretty much a more general point. Does that actually refer to the report in question? I'm just concerned that it's not actually relevant to the Leisure Services contract and Dave's report. It's more general in terms of training for members. But
I think there is. It's a bit more salient than that, in the sense that I do think it is relevant to this report as well, because this is what audit have touched upon, and I do think perhaps that is a way of addressing this need as well. So I don't entirely agree what you're saying, Gareth, but I do appreciate where you're coming from.
Right, I can see that Tom wanted to come in on that, and also a question from Mr. Lewis. So if I go to Tom first.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to say that I think you could comfortably sit a recommendation around Future Generations as part of that report, because Audit Wales use the Future Generations Act as a lens through which to conduct the review. It's part of their duties in terms of executing, or it's how they work in executing their duty under the Act. And actually the conversation that you were just having at committee in terms of what constitutes long term, with Dave talking about aspects of involvement and engagement, that they're actually a really good case study for how the various different considerations as part of Future Generations really come into play. So if you wanted to make that recommendation, we could certainly look to do some awareness and training. It's something that I'm probably unusually passionate about, so I'm very happy to spend some time talking with members about Future Generations and how we can support that.
Okay, thank you for that, Tom. Mr. Lewis.
I do apologise, Mr. Chairman. I pressed the button by accident when I was looking for a charger.
No worries at all. Well, in that case, then, if we move back to the recommendations, I'm happy to include Councillor Wilson's point about the 5 ways of working. So as long as we have unanimity on that, I think we can agree that in addition to what is denoting the report. And on that basis, I have nothing further to add under either part 1 or part 2. So thank you to all members for joining us this evening. And it looks as though the next time we will see each other will be in May. So thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye, everybody.